So welcome back. We are, yes, coming towards the end here, but there's a few more sections to share with you. And sort of coming off of the previous module, I wanted to explore what can we learn from lichens. And in terms of that, I want to share a few stories of what I am calling the lichen line. So based on one of the questions from the previous section, we've already touched on this a little bit, but these are tidal lichens, and these are some examples of that real stratification you can see based on how close they are to submersion or different tidal zones. So lichens can actually, as you can see in these photos, completely cover the rocks close to the coast, depending on how disturbed the environment is and some other conditions, including the type of rock. Obviously, if it's a much more sandy or sandstone rock, you might have a different lichen community or less of a lichen community because that rock will break down much faster over time. But in these hard rocky coasts, you can get these really beautiful patterns where that black band right at the lower tidal level is your varicarias and hydropunctarias, and actually growing on the shells of some of those organisms, including limpets, but also barnacles, is Calemopsidium and some others. As you come further up, you can get this orangey band, and that is your xanthorias and your caloplacas. And as you move further up, you get a slightly more diverse community, which can often look quite white, but can have many colors, including browns and greens as well. And that's Lichenoras and Licidias and Aspicilias. And then you go a bit further up into just the salt spray or the ocean fog. And then you get your Roxellas and Nieblas and Ramelinas, and that's where you actually start getting some fruticose species along these bands. So if you were to learn enough about tidal lichens and then go to a beach you'd never gone to before, you could probably guesstimate the tides based on these bands. Again, there's a lot more that goes into it, but it's just a fun way to explore the lichen line. Another example of the lichen line, I think many of us live in urban areas, so I always like to include some urban lichens in my presentations, is this urban walks. How frequently used is a sidewalk in your area? Well, some of that can be based on the lichens. Now, these photographs, I must caveat this, these photographs were not taken in the Bay Area of California. They were taken in England, which is a much moister environment. And so you'll just generally get a whole lot more lichens growing directly on the sidewalk than you will here, even though, yes, we do have lichens growing on our sidewalks, even in downtown Berkeley. So not many of us would be tempted to do this, but if you encounter me in downtown Berkeley, don't be surprised if I'm actually crouching down over the sidewalk with a hand lens and getting excited about some random Caloplaca species. Now, a lot of these in this picture are Lichenoras and other things like that, but what I just want to show you here is you can learn a lot about human behavior from looking at lichen lines. So these are 3 different parts of a neighborhood, and you can definitely tell that the one on the far left, hardly anyone walks in that part of the neighborhood. And then in the middle picture, there's lichens on either side, so people really just walk down the center of this one curve here. They don't want to be too close to the inner or outer edge, I guess. And then this other one is very frequently walked upon, and there's only lichens right by the wall there. And so there's a lot that you can learn. There's no humans in these pictures, and yet we can still make a lot of predictions about human behavior based on this lichen line. Now I have to turn to a slightly sadder story, which is another lichen line, looking at Montane glaciers. So this is in Peru, in the mountains. And this is a montane glacier that's receding, like all montane glaciers are because of global climate change. But let's say we didn't know that, we would still know it based on the lichen line. Now it's a bit difficult to see, so I've added a red squiggle to show you just how different those rocks and soil are versus the rocks and soil leading up to the glacier. Looking closer, and unfortunately I couldn't find any images to include of this, but looking closer at that black area, those rocks are plastered with lichens. There's hardly any rock surface visible. And those are going to be things, again, like Licidias, Acrosporas, Rhizocarpon. These are a lot of crust lichens that are adapted to high montane rocky environments. And then between that red squiggle line and the Montane Glacier, which again, it's hard to get perspective, but that's a huge distance. This picture is taken from quite far away, is barren. If this was a natural progression of glacial retreat, there would be a natural gradient of lichen growth from that super plastered area to, okay, right by the edge of the Montane Glacier, there should be some bare rocks. But in between, we should see, you know, varying levels of lichens starting to colonize those rocks in lichen communities. We don't. Those rocks are bare, which means this is happening at way too fast of a rate. And so this is, again, another way that we can use the lichen line to understand what's happening in our environment, but a bit of a sadder story. So let me just see. And then another thing that lichens can tell us about, which I've alluded to several times throughout these modules, is lichens as air quality indicators. This is an idea that goes way back. Basically, Industrial Revolution, cities and air quality in general just gets much more polluted. There's the example in England of the pepper moth, or peppered moth, that no longer was camouflaged against the trees because it had this nice peppery quality on the wings. Interestingly, very well camouflaged against a tree covered in lichens, but not very well camouflaged against a tree covered in soot, which of course choked out and killed all the lichens. So then there was that cool study where actually some of them ended up having a black wing mutation, and then they could camouflage against the city trees. But suffice to say, the lichens were eradicated from the cities. And now, and for quite some time, we've been using lichens to monitor as we've been improving our air quality metrics, or air quality control. Lichens are coming back in. But there's still a gradient of lichen sensitivity to air quality, as I've mentioned multiple times. So things like our xanthorias and that Physia, they can really tolerate a lot of air pollution, particularly in terms of nitrogen. Then there's this intermediate area, that's where our Flavoparmelia falls, but also some other folio species. And then our very sensitive species, and that's, you have to really get out of that main city air to see your usneas, your hypogymnias, and then also this really cool one, Evernia, which is very distinctly green on one side and white on another. So you can really look around at the lichen community and get a good sense of how good your air quality is. Now, of course, we have co-variables. So if you're standing in the middle of a city and you're like, oh, there's a lot of xanthorias around here, well, you probably already know that you're standing in the middle of a city. But there are, they're still very useful indicators. They also are bioaccumulators. So people have actually quantified what's in them to, and again, that may be related to that sensitivity as we were talking about during the Q&A session before. So there, some folks have used them to sort of as another measurement of air quality over time, just in terms of what they've actually bioaccumulated from the environment. I had another thing to say about this. What was it? Don't know. We'll come back to it. But anyway, so lichens are a useful indicator of air quality. Yes, I remember. If you're in a place with 0 lichens, maybe be concerned. That's the takeaway message. Unless you're like deep in the ocean or something, then don't be surprised if you don't see any lichens. But any terrestrial environment where there are 0 lichens, and I mean 0, wonder why, question why, because you may want to get out of there.